Hello and welcome, everyone. We're going to wait a few seconds for folks to join us on the live stream and to join us here in Zoom, and then we'll kick things off and get started. Hello and welcome. We'll get started momentarily. Okay, let's kick things off as more people join us in the Zoom and on the live streams. Hello and welcome, everyone, to One Designer, One Work from AIGA, the Professional Association for Design. I'm Lishan Huang. This online series features one designer showcasing a work that is personally meaningful. We'll hear what inspires, challenges, or guides them. Our guest presenter today is Abigail Ayers. Abby will explore how the virtual reality experience, where thoughts go, encourages vulnerability and community in its users through storytelling and purposeful design. Before I introduce Abby officially, some announcements. First, a big shout out and thank you to all of our AIGA members who are tuning in. Your support makes programming like this accessible to the whole design community. So thank you again for being here and for your ongoing support. And then a reminder to everyone about our code of conduct, which governs all AIGA events. No harassment or abuse of any kind will be tolerated, and we reserve the right to remove participants who violate this policy. We'll post a link to that policy if you want to refer to it yourself. And for the folks who are joining us on Zoom today, please feel free to use the chat to tell us where you're tuning in from and to connect with your fellow participants. You can also post your questions in the Q&A pod that helps us keep track of the questions, and we'll get to as many as we can after Abby's presentation. And for those of you tuning in on our live streams, whether on LinkedIn, Facebook, or YouTube, also feel free to say hello in the comments. Our team is also monitoring the comments there. If you have any specific questions, we'll surface those to Abby, time permitting, as well. So with that taken care of, I'll move on to our introductions. Abigail Ayers is an animator and designer based in Columbus, Ohio, with a background in 3D animation, game environment art, and virtual reality design. Her master's research focused on developing a framework for designers working with narrative virtual reality content, highlighting the contributions of both the user and designer to create intentional and compelling virtual spaces. She's currently an interactive designer and developer for Little Seed, where she works on interactive experiences for clinical use. Over to you, Abby. I'll be back to moderate the Q&A later.
Awesome. Thank you for the introduction and for having me here today. I'm going to go ahead and get my slide deck up. Here we go. Okay, so I'm Abigail Ayers, and I'm very excited to be here today talking about the virtual reality experience, Where Thoughts Go. So kind of a brief outline of what we're going to be talking about today. We'll be discussing how the design of this experience encourages vulnerability in users that are in VR, the evolution of the project since, and also creator Lucas Rizzotto's work and approach. So this is a piece that for me was inspiring because it prompted me to ask questions, and above all, really influenced how I view my role as a designer and thinking about how users share stories and connect in virtual spaces and the nature of VR design in general. So a little bit more background and context about me. As mentioned, I currently work as an interactive designer and developer at Little Seed, where I work on interactive experiences for clinical settings and for research. And before that, I graduated with my animation degree from Columbus College of Art and Design. And while I was there, I really wanted to be an environment artist, making 3D assets and scenes for games. And while I was there, I got my first experience with virtual reality, making an environment that I then got to explore in VR. And there really wasn't any turning back after that. I moved from there to the Ohio State University, where I got my MFA in design. And that's really where I started to dig into game design and interactivity. And I'm especially interested in how stories are told in VR, how users and designers collaborate to create virtual spaces, and how the design decisions we make can fulfill narrative goals. So I started this journey in 2017, which was kind of at the height of this new commercial virtual reality boom. There was a period where it felt like software and technology were changing every 2 months. There were headsets coming out, there was mobile VR, there was tethered VR. Designers and studios were freely exploring and making and sometimes failing. Uh, and over time, common design trends and practices began to emerge and become more defined, and then having to be revisited every time a new feature reached the market. So in 2019, to keep up with these trends, I started picking 2 or 3 applications a week, and I would spend 15 to 20 minutes in each, kind of playing and observing and analyzing the choices that designers were making. And that's where I came across Where Thoughts Go. So this is a social VR experience, again, created by Lucas Rizzotto. And the premise is pretty straightforward. Users are taken into a series of environments where a single question is presented to them, and floating orbs appear and surround you, representing the responses of others who had done this experience before you. When you select them, you can listen to other users' responses to those questions in their own voices before recording your own and adding it to the collection. And in the prologue experience, the bulk of what this experience is, there are 5 questions that are asked in sequence. And after the last question, you're presented with all 5 of your responses to listen to together. So I have a short 30-second clip just to kind of show what that experience looks and feels like. The audio is very low, so keep that in mind. You might not hear it, but there is background music.
So I'd never met anyone who had.
So that was the experience of the question forming in front of you and then starting to select orbs to listen to them. And the questions start pretty lighthearted, asking about childhood dreams, asking about first loves, before getting more and more serious, talking about people that you miss or what you would do if you only had a short time left available to you. And instead of my usual 15 to 20 minutes, I spent almost an hour and a half responding to 5 questions and listening to all of the responses around me. And once it was over, my initial, response was to be stunned. Up until this point, I had been impacted definitely by other VR experiences and other narratives, but I had never been encouraged to share or contribute my own stories as authentically as this, to be part of an experience. So I was immersed in this experience so gently, I hadn't even noticed it happening, hence the hour and a half that passed. And it was funny to me because that was the entire point of even running it in the first place, to analyze VR experiences. And I fell immediately out of that. So I tend to be inspired by works that stick with you, often without even realizing it. And over time, you evolve with new perspectives and come back to. That's exactly what happened here. So through my entire time at grad school, I would return to this piece and start to understand what design choices were made and why they were so successful. This is where we start talking a little bit about this experience and why those design choices actually encourage you to share and open up in this virtual space. And something interesting about the technology itself, by nature, VR is isolating. We're asking users to visually close themselves off from the world and trust in designers and developers to construct a new one to inhabit. And that's where Thoughts Go surprised me, because it's aware of this and it actively uses that isolation to promote vulnerability and safety. Once you complete all 5 questions, there's a making of section that you can access, where the designer is talking about his experience actually creating this VR app. And he states that most developers see that as a negative of the technology or a difficulty, that it's an uphill battle once you put on the headset to create a place where you connect to others, where you are social. And he wanted to turn that seemingly negative fact into an advantage by creating an experience that absolutely needs that isolation to succeed. So most social VR apps that we have right now try to combat that isolation by creating usernames or virtual avatars to present yourself with, to represent you. And you use your headset mic to communicate. This is really effective in experiences like Rec Room or VR chat because you're there to talk to other people in real time and to play games together, but you're still bound by these social constructs. Your avatar still represents you. It's an identifier. You collect a social history, a judgment, positive and negative interactions. And the nature of those spaces, for the most part, is boundaries. It's caution and walls. I enter these rooms to discuss fairly surface level topics with people if I'm talking to them at all. For the most part, it's about gameplay. It's about the interaction with other avatars. And the design of those experiences doesn't really do anything to promote openness or introspection or honesty. It's used to promote that interaction, that gameplay. Where Thoughts Go is unique in that it leaves no representation or identifiers beyond the sound of your voice. Everyone is represented by these same orbs. There's no avatars, no accounts, no usernames. There's not even a date that it was recorded. You could put me in a room full of people who completed this experience, and I would have an extremely difficult time connecting each person to their response. And that anonymity becomes a point of safety because there aren't any virtual stakes. I will point out kind of an obvious plot hole here before going too far. I'm talking a lot about social interactions while you're in VR, while you're in the headset, but we are still physical humans and our physical surroundings still matter. So I've only completed this experience in a room by myself, out of earshot of anyone else. And if you asked me to do this in the middle of a crowded auditorium, or even sitting amongst a group of friends, it would be a completely different experience. And I know my answers would change. Rizzotto, the designer, also mentions this in that making of section, stating that he saw a performance starting to happen around other people, where your responses become more about them and less about you. So when setting up an installation for this experience, when he was touring with it, he made a kind of pillow fort for users to climb into that had soft lights and blankets and pillows and was sectioned off from the rest of the physical world, creating a safety that supports what you're going to have in the virtual world. And I found that really interesting, that it was intentional that you need to be physically isolated as well as virtually isolated. The other kind of pillar of safety here is that there's not really a point where you're not in control of your experience. You can leave at any point. There's no moment where you're rushed, where the experience is telling you, hey, hurry up, or trying to remind you of your task. It's not necessary at all. There's a clear direction forward. You know what you're supposed to do, but there's no forward force. So you can record your response as many times as you want. You can record yourself over until you find the words that best suit what you want to say. And I absolutely took advantage of that. You can move the orbs around and grab them at will and look around your environment and view the scenery. There's even an element of playfulness in that you can take these orbs and throw them at the letters and they'll scatter and reform. So importantly, you can decide what and how much to share. There's no time limit. It doesn't say you have to fill up these 10 seconds. The first question of the experience asks about childhood dreams, and there's a huge range of answers. Quite a few were pretty straightforward and simple, like mine. It was to be an astronaut, and I said why. But there were also other answers like to be loved or to be cared for. And some were 3-word responses, others elaborated for 3 minutes, and no response is more valid than the other. It's up to each user how open they want to be with the rest of the space. So keeping that in mind, we've got this anonymity and this agency that's creating safety around their users. But as designers, how can we then encourage users to be vulnerable and honest in their answers when they have all of this control? And where thoughts go, the answer is it's a collaborative effort. It comes from the designer and the community. So on the part of the designer, each environment is created to match the tone of the questions that are being asked of you. And the first question about childhood dreams puts you in an ice world. with bright blues and whites and a very light palette for a lighthearted question. And the sound design is soothing. There's light bells, there's chorus. The orbs that appear around you do so slowly. They float in like snowflakes. There's nothing in the animations, the music, or the visual language that's intended to rush you or to encourage you to explore your environment. It's intended to be still. So when we're asked about someone we miss, we're in a snowy space still, but now it's nighttime with deep blues and stars. And it's wistful. To me, it feels sad, but it's open to interpretation. Some people talk about people close to them who have passed. Some people talk about friends that they haven't seen in a decade. By the time we reach the last question related to death, the environment is dark, it's quiet, it's cavernous. There's barely anything you can see around you. The music is low with bells, barely audible. It's a fast, but it's a very distinct progression. So even the presence of questions in the space at all is an important move. Rizzotto mentions that in earlier versions of the project, there were no questions. They were just these open environments for people to speak their minds. But when users are faced with all that open space, they freeze up. They don't know what to say. Recordings don't come as easy. So providing a question in that environment creates a necessary focal point. But without the users themselves, what you get is 5 really nice environments. So the set of responses that accompanies each question is the true heart of the experience. Being able to listen to other users' responses, being able to hear joy in someone's voice when reminiscing about wanting to be an archaeologist, or hear someone's voice crack or shake when they're talking about someone that they've lost, adds a tone and a depth to the entire experience that really visual design can only hint at. And it adds an authenticity and sets a mindset for the user that discourages trolling or mocking the space. It feels wrong to take it that way. And I was surprised at how forthcoming the responses were, and it prompted me to do the same. And so we have this great cycle where you're adding your responses to a space, creating more safety, adding to this tone, drawing in more and more responses for the next person to build a community around each question. And I thought community is an interesting word here. Because like I said, there's no usernames or ways to connect outside of the headset. You don't really know anything about anyone besides what they choose to share. But I noticed that I still felt responsible for what I had heard. And I had an internal debate while making this presentation about whether or not it was right to share any quotes or include any responses in my videos today. It almost felt like a betrayal of trust, which I found completely fascinating, that this experience was compelling enough to impact how I was telling other people about it later. So in the almost 3 years since my first run through, the experience has continued to evolve. It's been released on multiple VR platforms, and there have been 3 new modules added, each with their own unique questions and themes. And what's fascinating to me about these is that they've taken that initial sequence of questions and the concept of asking questions in safety and directly given each environment a purpose. So in the prologue, unless you've done it before, you don't really know what question's coming your way. You're just moving from 1 through 5. And in these modules, your intention is very clear. So the ones that stood out to me most were the thankful and the unsaid, especially after the last year and a half we've just had in this pandemic. This design change felt, very, very telling. The thankful is a space for gratitude and appreciation. It takes place in bright ruins surrounded by waterfalls and light. You're invited to share something that you're grateful for in your life, and all the users' responses make it feel like you're surrounded by these small moments of appreciation. And it's the only question asked, the only intention for the space. And to me, it felt like stepping into a photo booth and closing the curtain for a moment before stepping out. The other side of that is the unsaid, which functions as a virtual memorial, a place to release messages for those who are no longer with us. And the direct question that's asked that you see on the screen is, think of someone you've lost. What do you wish you could tell them? The environment itself is kind of unexpected. It's not the dark space you see at the end of the prologue. It's very vibrant. It's full of deep purples and gold, and it's in a cavern. And in the prologue, you're asked about someone you miss. And that's, like I said, that's open for interpretation. This is directing you to a specific place of loss and creating a safe way to express that. And we see this sometimes from players within games, especially last year in the pandemic, we had Animal Crossing New Horizons come out. And it's interesting as players have these individual islands that often you create a space for your character or for you to reflect or to honor someone who's gone, sometimes even unintentionally. There's usually not a dedicated environment from the designer for that purpose, though, for the purpose of processing and feeling. And it's a really fascinating moment where we can take a sequence of questions that embodies an experience. And when we bring it down to one space and one question, you can see it almost becoming a tool. It's almost a different purpose. The prologue is not something you would play every single day. You don't repeat it multiple times in succession. Your answers wouldn't really change. It would cease to be as meaningful. But a single space, like the unsaid or the thankful, can exist more presently for users to visit when needed. And I'm really interested in seeing how more questions are added and how more spaces develop as this project grows and which directions the designer chooses to go. Speaking of the designer, I've spent a lot of time talking about the experience, why it's fascinating, why it's successful, and I really wanted to take some time also to talk about the designer and his process. And I tend to follow pieces and not necessarily artists or designers or studios. So I'll admit that I didn't know very much about him until recently. In all of his online bios and content, Lucas Rizzotto describes himself as a mad scientist. And I find it very hard to disagree with that fact. He works in virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, you name it. If he has an idea and he feels strongly about it, he does it. And he's also a frequent participant in hackathons. He has a YouTube channel called Lucas Builds the Future. I've added all of his social media handles and ways to find him. So I highly recommend you check out his stuff. But some projects that have stood out to me recently, because Where Thoughts Go was kind of one of these experiments. He recently made a VR time machine where he wore a camera for a year and created a machine in VR that would show him any given day throughout the year, complete with levers and buttons and the very Back to the Future date on the top of it. During quarantine, he went into augmented reality and made a portal that busts a virtual hole in his wall that reveals an avatar of his friend on the other side so they could actually chat and communicate and hang out while stuck in their separate apartments. So I find his content both amusing and really validating because he doesn't hold back describing design challenges and his process. And that really extended into the making of portion of Where Thoughts Go. So I've mentioned this a couple times throughout the presentation, but this making of sequence looks very similar to all of the other environments. A similar scene of orbs, all filled with commentary from Rizzotto describing the thought process behind the design, earlier iterations, pitfalls that he encountered while testing it out. And normally, making of sequences tend to be pretty procedural. We hear other designers talking about inspiration. We hear them showing background on how levels were created and wireframes, but these tend to also come from higher level studios. Rizzotto is very real and relatable with challenges that he faces in his design work that I also face daily in my personal work as well. So for example, Where Thoughts Go was created while he was learning how to code. And he mentions having to recode the experience 5 times before building it. That's something I can definitely relate to. Or having trouble determining when to stop messing with the project and actually let it out into the world, dealing with imposter syndrome. I know it was startling for me to learn that the environments that I've been showing you throughout this presentation, it was actually placeholder art until he could find a 3D artist, but people liked it so much that it stayed. So these are all kind of facets of design that's usually only talked about amongst friends and coworkers, but it's really, really wonderful to hear it talked about within a piece and about a piece. He even mentions several points about safety and control that I talked about today, confirming that those design choices were intentional and that after some test runs, that's how he came to those conclusions. A particularly personal comment that hit me was I learned that we crossed paths at the same hackathon a few years ago. And I had absolutely no idea until I heard that particular orb in this experience. So to kind of wrap this up, in the last 5 years, the toolbox that's been available for VR designers has expanded exponentially. We have access to an unprecedented amount of options for interaction and for building experiences, and it's often really difficult to select what works best for your design goals. And it's sometimes tempting to try everything at once, especially when new things come out, things like hand tracking, eye tracking, different types of haptics. I sometimes refer to it as the Jurassic Park question, where just because we can doesn't mean we should. And that's a line I find myself treading constantly. And that's something I really love about this experience, and that has stayed with me since I first saw it. That the goal here is to connect with other people by sharing small stories, small pieces of ourselves. And it really shows that sometimes all you really need is a place of safety and listening. And if we can provide that, the users can do the rest. So that's all I have for you today. I think I ran a little bit short, but thank you again for listening. And I really hope you'll check out both Lucas and this experience. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Great. Thank you so much, Abby, for sharing that little piece about yourself today. I just wanted to remind our audience, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A pod if you're joining us here on Zoom, or if you're watching the live stream, you can post in the comments there and we'll surface any questions that we can, time permitting. So I want to take the chance to kick things off with the first question for you, Abby. I'm curious to learn, how did you get into VR yourself?
Yeah, while I was at CCAD and kind of in getting enveloped into environment art and game environment art, that was very much on the art asset making side. It wasn't so much about interaction or game design. And I got the opportunity to take a virtual environments course at CCAD with Steve Hubbard that was using the Oculus Development Kit 2. So 2015, so the Oculus Rift hadn't been released yet. And the whole goal of the class was to create an environment in VR that you could explore. And we didn't have controllers. It was basically just headset, keyboard and mouse. But that kind of just really hooked me. Like, similar to what drew me into animation, that kind of anticipation of waiting for a render to come up where all of your materials are coming together and your lighting is coming together and you see that final space. Getting to do that in VR is kind of an awesome feeling, and it hasn't gone away.
Yeah.
So yeah, it just went up from there. So shout out to Steve and Charlotte Bellin. This is definitely your fault.
Wonderful. And you had mentioned earlier in your presentation that you tend to follow like specific pieces of VR work rather than maybe studios or individual creators. How do you discover stuff? I guess, with TV back in the day, you could like channel surf to find things, or look in the TV guide, or, music, you could read magazines or go to the record store. I'm totally dating myself, but like, how do you discover VR things out in the world that you actually want to spend time with?
I mean, it's not a terrible comparison. It's usually basically channel surfing through Steam or the Oculus library. So that's one way of doing it. I would scroll through the VR experiences that were available commercially in Steam and on the Oculus. Before the Rift was released, when I was taking that course, we would go online and find free experiences that people had made and would just download them and try them just to see what was happening. But yeah, I usually stick to those two libraries, or I have a solid group of friends on Discord who are very, very much into VR gaming, and they'll sometimes throw titles my way, and that's another way. I'll hear a title or hear a review or see something cross my path and just follow it and try it out.
Very cool. So we have an audience question from Dan, who is a current UCF student doing an internship. Dan wants to know, was it difficult to keep up in your work with the initial VR commercial boom in the mid to late 2000s with all the new attention and innovations?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry, my dog agrees with me. Yes, it was. I think between 2017 and 2018, there was a point where a new technology would come out or a new SDK or toolbox, and then every other software or device that relied on that needed a solid month or two to catch up. So if I was working, I actually had this experience, I was working on a 10-week project, and by the time I got to week 7, there was a huge Steam VR update, which is what I was using to run the whole experience, that broke everything. It was completely unplayable. So yeah, things like that would happen where suddenly you would be using a toolkit that wasn't compatible with the VR version that you were using. And it was a lot of juggling back and forth and making sure that all these puzzle pieces would actually fit together. But I mean, the flip side of that is it's also super exciting because then you can, by the end of the semester, something new would come out and you would get to try that. So yeah, I guess it depends how you're looking at it. If I was working on a long-term project, it didn't bode well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So could you tell us more about your work with Little Seed? What does it mean to create interactive experiences for clinical use?
Yeah, so with Little Seed, we do a lot of work with hospitals and research institutions, and it's usually, I'm trying to figure out which experiences I can actually talk about. We do, okay, I think I can talk about this one. There is a project called Voxel Bay, now known as Voyager, that was a mobile VR experience for kids who had to go to the hospital to receive frequent shots and injections for hemophilia.
Mhm.
And that was done in partnership with Nationwide Children's Hospital. I think there's a couple research papers on it if you want to check it out. But it's basically creating experiences like that, sometimes in VR, sometimes not, that have to fulfill this second set of goals where it's not just about story, it's not just about interaction. You also have some other constraints, like if someone's getting an injection, they can't move their hands, or you can only turn your head so far, or if it's mobile VR, you don't necessarily have controllers. So how do we create these engaging experiences? It's a lot of trying to find ways around constraints like that, which is super exciting. It's kind of just having a big puzzle and just finding your way around all of these different questions. So I think that's the best way I can answer it. A lot of what I do is programming and game design and interaction design. But like I said, not always in VR. So sometimes I get the chance to try out some other mediums.
That's great. So on that point of trying out different mediums, how do you think about your expertise, I guess? Like you have a focus in VR, obviously, but how do you kind of translate this across mediums since you are working across these different mediums and formats and platforms?
Yeah, I got pretty lucky in that both of my kind of degrees mesh together very, very well.
Mhm.
So there are times where it's really, really helpful to be able to look at things as an artist, and times when it's super, super helpful to have that design background and know how one affects the other. Um, I've kind of expanded my skill sets into covering a lot of, I can wear a lot of caps, basically,
Yeah.
covering as many bases as I can. So like I said, right now I get to do a lot of programming, and that's something that I'm working on growing in. It's not,
Yeah.
doesn't come as naturally to me as some of the other aspects of 3D design, but sometimes it's just, it comes out of necessity. This is what needs to be done, and we have a certain amount of people on the team, and enough to try and work through this. So, but I also like that type of environment where I'm not just stuck doing the same thing every single day. Every day is always different, and I kind of love that.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point about necessity being the mother of invention. And also, I guess when you're working in a field where the software could change in a 10-week period, like everyone is going to be new to it, right? So that everybody's
Yeah.
kind of on similar learning curves of relearning.
Yeah, Fortunately, it's slowed down a little bit, so there's some safety.
That's good to hear. We have a LinkedIn question. They want to know what type of security or privacy concerns are there? This is talking about the Rizzotto app, the Rizzotto VR experience, to protect others from viewing your personal recordings in the VR. How does it address these sort of privacy issues?
Yeah, so what I've seen and read about it is that the developer makes it very clear that he takes it seriously and that he's not collecting any of your data, that it really is just the voice recording. I don't have specifics on that. I do have concerns because obviously it's pulling from a live mic. But I'm not sure what measures he's taken to ensure that other data isn't being collected. I like that it's a point that he's made and stated explicitly that, hey, this is important to us. Your anonymity is important to us. You know, we're not going to post or use any of this information. I tend to have a little bit more trust in that because it is a singular developer. But yeah, there's definitely, I think, especially as VR is growing now, there's a lot more privacy concerns than there were when this experience was made as well. So I don't know if that answered your question entirely. I really don't know what specific measures he's taken.
That's totally fair. I think, even if there isn't that other form of personally identifiable data, there's like all sorts of scary developments with just voice stuff alone, right? Whether it's through like that case with the children's toys that were listening to kids and then selling that data as training data for voice recognition software. Or recently I heard from my bank, like when I was calling in to get some customer support, they're rolling out this voice print technology that's basically like analyzing your voice to identify who you are. So they also have like tons of people's voices there. I opted out of that, but I think that's where we're heading with this voice stuff. And then there's the Anthony Bourdain controversy. Apparently the documentary filmmaker who did the Anthony Bourdain documentary that's out now used this voice synthesizer software to basically like recreate Bourdain's voice to read an email that he sent, but didn't actually record on mic when he was alive. So anything with your voice on it, somebody can do something.
Yeah, it's starting to get scary. And from what I've been seeing from recent Facebook releases as well for Oculus and new headsets that have been coming out, that they're collecting more and more biometric data as well, and not being very specific with what that data is actually being used for. So, I mean, I think there was an announcement recently where Facebook is trying to work on a metaverse where everything is connected, and that's kind of, we were already in scary waters with the biometric data, but now having all our media is connected is, it's definitely some concerns.
Yeah, this like term metaverse being used by big tech, I think like Microsoft is using it too. I just can't help but to think about the whole like Marvel Cinematic Universe and Loki and all of these sort of timelines when tech companies are talking about it.
It's a bit surreal, actually, seeing all this come up and saying, well, I definitely have read a sci-fi book with that, but I guess we're here now. So, yeah.
We are in the VR time machine, I guess, or that is reality, the actual reality time machine. So do you have any career advice for folks who are thinking about getting into VR? Maybe they're already doing design or animation, other related fields, and want to pivot into VR. Do you have any advice for those folks?
I know this is kind of the most stereotypical device or advice in this field, but just do it. You have to start somewhere with something, pick a skill set that interests you and go after it, and start talking, look in your community and see if there are community meetups. I know in Columbus we have a bunch of game meetups where, I don't like using the term hobbyist, but it's kind of a bunch of people who are investigating VR and trying new things in VR and getting to talk about it together. So look for those spaces as well. And there's a ton of spaces online now where you can connect with other designers and see what they're doing. highly recommend, as you're working on these skills, if you decide to go into the programming side or the art side or all of the above, start getting into hackathons. It's your skills do not have to be 100% to do it. You just need to get in there and talk to other people. And I think being part of that team is the best way to kind of get an idea of what VR development is all about. And it's kind of a wonderful place where you get to experiment and see all these different ideas, and kind of a whirlwind, but you make a lot of connections as well. So yeah, just get started with something, anything, even if it's small, and start talking and poking around your community and see what's there, see what hackathons are out there.
Wonderful. Thank you for that advice. We have a question from Wilson, who is asking about VR and accessibility. Are there ways in which VR has catered experiences for people who are differently abled? For example, someone with only one hand.
Yeah, it's not as seen as commonly in like the big commercial VR experiences. I think the most common thing you'll see is seated versus standing. Like a lot of the like more interactive experiences require two controllers, and there's not a ton of ways that I've seen that developers have tried to get around that. One thing that I know we've done in Little Seed with Fox Bay when I was talking about not being able to move your hands is using gaze tracking, or gaze interaction. So being able to turn your head to interact with things instead of using your hands at all. Yeah, I haven't seen a ton of it. That's probably the best answer I can give, is that I've seen a lot of the gaze tracking, and I've seen a lot of the like height adjustment things, and being able to have static gameplay where you're not moving versus physically walking around a space versus teleporting. But it definitely needs to be more commonplace, especially in bigger VR releases as well.
Yeah. I've seen some cool experiments and developments in just like 360 immersive audio too, for people, for people who with sight, but also people who are blind or don't have sight or limited visual capacity. Of like, you can still immerse yourself in an audio environment that's interactive based on like how you move your head and your body and stuff like that. So I think that's another example of stuff that is accessible to people with different senses or disabilities.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have a couple minutes left before we wrap up. Looks like we're out of audience questions. So Abby, I'll just turn it back to you for a couple prompts. What is inspiring you right now besides this piece that you've shared today? Is there anything you want to recommend, whether it's a show or a book or podcast or music, whatever you'd like?
Gosh. Weirdly enough, putting together this presentation kind of re-inspired me in wanting to make things, and looking at more about Lucas, kind of wanting to do all of these small scale experiences. I don't know that there's a single kind of show or experience or anything that's inspiring me directly right now. I don't know how many other designers have faced this with quarantine, but I'm feeling kind of less inclined in my personal time to be making in VR, because I'm also doing that for work 8 hours a day.
Totally.
So I've been more inspired by trying to find other skill sets, like moving into woodworking, or trying to return back to kind of my art school basics of getting back into sketching. Like, I guess what's inspiring me right now is kind of stepping back and taking a breath and then coming back in. In terms of actually developing personal work, I mentioned that kind of friend group that's very into VR gaming. They're kind of keeping me on with the inspiration, because we've been doing personal design challenges between each other where we're challenging each other to make something, and that's been super helpful. I think, and not having me totally drift away into, you know, learning how woodworking
Yeah.
goes. Yeah, I guess talking to friends right now is what's most inspiring me
That's so
outside of
awesome
work.
to have that creative community and that peer group where you can support each other, but also have like some, I guess, friendly competition or motivation to do stuff and to make stuff.
Yeah,
So
and
yeah.
yeah.
Oh, please.
Oh, that was what I had.
So just final prompt for me, call to action. Abby, do you have any call to action you want to give to our viewers today, whether it's how to find you and stay connected with your work online or something to check out of yours?
Sure. I mean, you can find my website at abigailAyersart.com if you want to see more about kind of my background and my journey through VR. Um, I am probably most active on LinkedIn, where you can also find me, Abigail Ayers, and connect with me and message back and forth. Um, I don't have any ongoing projects right now, but as I'm trying to get back into it, those would be the two places to find it.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again for that presentation and the Q&A, Abby. Thank you all for tuning in to this live or for watching the playback recording. And we'll see you at the next One Designer, One Work from AIGA, the Professional Association for Design. I'm Li Shan Huang. See you at the next one.